Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by defense reporter Mike Brest. Mike, the whole conflict between Russia and Ukraine took a really scary turn this week. Talk a little bit about what happened and why there was some concern about maybe it dragging the United States and NATO into the war.
So there were two main things that happened this week. The one you're referring to is the fact that there was a missile that left Ukrainian airspace and landed in Poland, a couple miles from the border, and actually killed two Polish individuals. Now this immediately sent massive red flags up across the world because it really was demonstrating the possibility in the onset that NATO could be drawn into the war, Poland being a NATO member. Now this would bring NATO in direct conflict with Russia, which the U.S. and NATO has said that ultimately was one of their main priorities throughout this entire war, was to avoid that very exact situation where NATO would feel Poland and then the alliance itself would feel an obligation to respond specifically militarily. Now, cooler heads have prevailed, at least in the immediate aftermath. We're about a couple of days removed, and there, in the initial investigation, we've actually found out that the missile that killed these two individuals tragically was a Ukrainian air defense missile that missed or partially struck a Russian missile. And now we know that this strike or this defensive missile came in the midst of a large Russian barrage of missiles literally across the country. There were these missiles that were fired all the way in the west, like this one, for example, that would have required Ukrainian air defense in the western part of the country, but also in the north and the south and even in the east where fighting has been ongoing for a while now. So this barrage, we had seen somewhat of a lull in these rocket attacks in the early parts of November, but they really ramped up earlier this week, and as a result, one of these Ukrainian air defense rockets that were supposed to intercept one of these Russian missiles tragically landed in Poland, killing two people. And now, even though we're hearing that from the U.S. side and we're hearing that from NATO, Ukrainian leader President Zelensky maintains that this rocket was actually of Russian origin. So there is a little bit of a disconnect there, and we're still waiting to see how exactly that'll play out because it's really right now his word versus Poland, which is backed by NATO and the U.S. So this is one area of friction in this whole thing, but overall, it is a good sign that cooler heads have prevailed in the immediate aftermath of this incident.
Because it does seem to now be a Western consensus that it wasn't of Russian origin, but which would have been a real problem because Poland is a NATO member state, and that has Article 5 implications.
Absolutely, and so sort of the other aspect is, while the West is sort of in agreement that this was a Ukrainian fire, they still blame Russia. They still say, Ukraine wouldn't have had to fire this missile if it hadn't been for the barrage from Russia. So, the U.S. is saying that this was a Ukrainian missile, but at the same time, Russia is still at fault for these deaths, as they are, they say, all of the deaths that have occurred throughout this war.
But it wouldn't necessarily require us to come to the defense of Poland against Russia militarily. The way Article 5, which is Article 5 is the provision of the NATO treaty that requires us all to come together.
So Article 5, Article 5 requires every country who's in the alliance view an attack on themselves, or an attack on another ally is an attack on themselves, which often would incur a military response, which is why everyone has been so concerned about the war in Ukraine spilling over to a NATO ally.
So, in talking about the Russian offensive in Ukraine, we're getting close to the wintertime. Obviously, that will affect some of Russia's strategy. It'll affect some of Ukraine's ability to defend itself. It'll affect the terrain on which the war is fought. Talk a little bit about where we see things headed right now.
So that's a great question, and there are a couple of things that favor the Ukrainian side. There are a couple of things that favor the Russian side. It should be noted that Russia really is not doing great in terms of maintaining the territory that they've held, or getting new territory, capturing new territory. Earlier this week, they retreated from Kherson, which was really one of the earliest cities that they captured and one of the only city centers that they had. And their retreat from Kherson was a huge deal. It was a monumental victory for morale throughout Ukraine. We saw people go to the streets celebrating. And this is one of the 4 regions that Russia and, Vladimir Putin allegedly annexed.
Right.
And, I say allegedly because the U.S. And every Western country unanimously rejected these claims of annexation.
Right.
And so this is one of these areas that they claim to have annexed, and yet their troops retreated from it.
Sure.
So this really was a monumental victory. And so we're seeing the fighting will slow down as the winter months come, because it's harder for these types of weapons and military vehicles to move and to actually battle in the winter months. We're hearing that there's an expectation that the actual fighting will stop will slow down between the two sides, and it will be used as a time for these troops to sort of refit and get resupplied and sort of take time to recover over the last couple months. But it should also be noted that the war did start last February, so it's not like the war will stop completely.
Right. Well, there are some who hope that this Russian retreat marks a turning point in the war in Ukraine's favor.
Absolutely. And the other thing is, the U.S., whether it's President Biden or Secretary Austin or General Milley, from a military perspective, they've all said that Ukraine will determine how and when they return to the negotiating table.
Right.
But they've said victories like the one in Kherson will help their hand whenever they get there.
So Democrats have lost control of the House. It took about a week after the election for Republicans to clinch a House majority, but there's been a change in control. Is that going to have any effect on Congress's ability to pass new aid for Ukraine?
So it's unclear exactly how this will play out, but we do know that this was not in Ukraine's best interest, at least from the start, from the outset. There's a chance that Russia will continue to fund aid to Ukraine. We've heard obviously some pushback in the past, but it really has come from a vocal minority,
right.
A really small section of the Republican Party. So it'll be, interesting to see moving forward if that group becomes more vocal, if they're able to, get more numbers,
right.
And then they could really pose a problem. But with a, closely divided House combined with so many Democrats nearly unanimously supporting aid to Ukraine, it really isn't hard to see that, the Democratic minority having enough Republican, members join them that they would easily carry a Ukraine aid bill.
Right. Certainly on a vote, it's easy to see how you could get a bipartisan majority, because there are bipartisan majorities in favor of
Absolutely.
the Biden administration's policy on this and of what we've spent in the past. At the same time, the fact that it's a small Republican minority could mean that voices within the Republican caucus that don't want to continue the aid might have greater influence than they would have had in a bigger majority.
Absolutely, and so that's another thing we'll have to see is the fact that we're aware of this small contingent of Republicans who have made a stink about providing aid to Ukraine in the past, represents now the current power that they may have moving forward in terms of potentially holding up legislation that would provide Ukraine aid.
Thank you, Mike. You can read Mike and the rest of our national security team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.